Okay, very good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the ones who rejoined the main venue after the breakup sessions, and we are here with a very exciting session ahead of us. This is not going to be people talking, but this is going to be an instance of dialogue. And I think there is a lot of potential in order to exchange ideas, exchange experiences, and think about EMI probably from different perspectives. So, welcome again. My name is Mario Moja. I am the Program Director of the EMI in English Language Teaching at the University of East London in the UK. I've been working with the British Council in a number of different projects in the area of academic literacies in the context of English as a medium of instruction. I am going to ask the lovely panel that we have this afternoon to introduce themselves, and I am going to ask to introduce where you come from and the institution you are representing today. Over to you, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nino Grebolashvili, Professor of Medicine, Tbilisi State University. At this moment, I hold the post of Deputy Rector, so Vice Rector by Science and Research. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Erkin Muhamedov from Westminster International University here in Tashkent. I'm head of Global English Department.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Karabasova from Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. Over the last 5 years, I've been involved in different research projects related to EMI, multilingual education, and mostly I'm a CLIL person, just a note.
Hello, I'm Tony Liddicoat. I'm Professor in Applied Linguistics and Director of Research in the Centre for Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick in the UK.
Hello, everyone. I'm Susanna. I'm representing the Ministry of Education and Science of the Republic of Armenia. I am Chief Specialist of the Department of Policy Development on Higher and Postgraduate Professional Education and dealing with all policy documents within the higher education. That's all.
Thank you very much, panel members. As you can see, we have a very good representatives, a varied perspective that we're going to take advantage of this afternoon. The session is going to run in this way. We want this to be as interactive as possible, right? So we are going to be promoting and encouraging the panel members to tell us about their experiences, but also you to take part as well. There will be 2 slots allocated for the panel members to share their experiences. There will be 2 topics that we're going to be discussing this afternoon. One is in relation to opportunities for EMI at an institutional and at an international level. And the second slot is going to be about constraints, challenges, pitfalls, and how to overcome them. So in between, we're going to open up the floor so that if you feel like making a contribution in the form of a question, in the form of a story, an anecdote, something, we're going to invite you to put your hand up and somebody will come running to you with a microphone, right? But we have something else. We're going to start the session today with a voting motion. And the idea behind this is that we want to gauge the audience sort of perceptions, ideas, and beliefs about EMI. We're going to do the same at the end of the debate to see if, those opinions, ideas, and beliefs swayed in any way. So here is the motion that we would like you to vote on. And the possibilities are two. Agree or disagree, right? So the motion is EMI can add to the learning experience of our students. I say it again. EMI can add to the learning experience of our students. If you agree, now first of all, it's going to be more interesting. If you disagree with this statement, can you put your hand up, please? At the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Off you go. Okay, we have only one hand going up. Thank you very much for being so brave. That's great. So, how many of you then agree? Fantastic. How many of you are in there in between? I don't really know. Thank you very much, table number 4. And thank you very much to the people to the table number 12, number 6, and the member of the panel. Let's see what happens. Okay, so we're going to start off then by asking the members of the panel to tell us a little bit about how they see opportunities for EMI at an institutional and international level. And before they start, I am relying on colleagues from the British Council to show me the time, right? We start with the 20 minutes now. So over to you, members of the panel, whoever you want to start, please feel free to do so.
EMI is good for at the institutional level because if you provide EMI provision, then universities will be able to attract international students, which means that's an economic benefit, and that's good for universities' budget as well as the budget of the government.
I think the question of whether EMI can add or cannot add to learning experience of students depends on the definition, how you define this concept. So my colleagues have actually tried to make a distinction, conceptual distinction between EMI and the content and language integrated learning. If we just go straight to the definition of EMI, it is using English for teaching academic subjects, right? And unlike content and the language integrated learning approach, where students do not necessarily have to be proficient in the target language, right? In EMI, we usually expect students coming already equipped with linguistic repertoire, right? With all the linguistic skills. In this case, of course, EMI can add to their learning experiences. But in reality, what we announce as a program, as an EMI or whatever, or CLIL, but what we have in reality usually are different, right? So that's why this maybe the division in this audience can be explained by this fact, how you define actually this approach.
If we are looking through the problem, like what our students are requiring from us, not what we are requiring from our students, we have to look to the societal requirements as well. As for many countries who are presented here, there are a problem of employment, there is a problem of in certain cases, non-adequate, non-equal education. So through the language, we can give more modern knowledge, further this knowledge, and of course, there is a good issue to involve our students in social exchange, in exchange programs as well. One of the reasons why we think that English is very important of higher education is that what I look through, more job descriptions with language skills are asking people to come and take place in their international or even the local level activities. On an institutional level, we are trying to do more double degree programs. We are trying to do more exchange programs, and most of these programs are the requirement is to study English and to have this English language proficiency. Thank you.
So, talking about the opportunities for EMI from the point of university, I'd like to mention that it's very beneficial for them in terms of EMIs can increase researchers and scientific attentions, which will itself facilitate innovation within the higher education institution. But talking about from the point of view students, it's depends. It's very difficult to not to shift like professional subject-oriented outcomes and subject competencies with language competencies. So that's why I cannot say that it will be beneficial for students just to increase their language abilities and not to push their professional skills.
Okay. Taking on from that skeptical note, my particular stance is that EMI can be an opportunity, but it most often isn't. And I'll leave the discussion of what I think the problem is until later in this session when we talk about constraints. I think as a matter of principle, though, it can be very good and very useful for a student to learn content material in a language other than the first language. That it does contribute to educational enrichment, that it does have a place in education. And there are actually many good models of immersion teaching, for example, that happen around the world that show that there are particular advantages if this sort of work is done well in the right context. I think, however, there is a lot to be learnt about how context changes the situation, and what works very well in one context may not work equally well in another. So I'm going to, like my colleague here, Susanna, I'm going to sit on the fence about this. I think there are very good things that can happen, but I think it needs very careful thinking and planning.
At an international level, EMI increases the chances of mobility both for teachers and students. So let's say if the students want to change their credits or transfer their credits to a different European university or American university, then this actually good for students. Students can move without any obstacles, and the same for teachers.
So, continuing Yerken's argument, so indeed at the international level there are more opportunities. It's Bologna reforms, internationalization and academic mobility, but from my point of view, on the other hand, it is a bad thing because international opportunities are driving national contexts and institutional contexts just to favor symbols over substance. I like this phrase from Michael Fullan. So without any substantial changes, there are different things, what we appears and what we have in reality. So these international things and attractiveness are also actually driving many institutional contexts which don't have enough sufficient resources for implementing high quality EMI.
I'd just like to follow on from that and make an observation that sometimes in our discussions we confuse English abilities with EMI. And I would say that in the contemporary world, having English is very important for increasing mobility, for increasing internationalization, for engaging in different networks and so on. However, that does not mean that EMI is necessarily the pathway there. And we should be very careful to separate out the idea of high-level English language abilities And I think high-level abilities in multiple languages is actually a very good thing, from the question of EMI. The issue is not whether English helps you, it's whether EMI is the best way to develop the English language abilities that you need. I think one of those questions is actually answered already for us. I think the world has moved to such a place where you do need to be able to speak English. I note we're here in Tashkent speaking English. That sort of indicates something about mobility and academic language use and so on. But whether we got here through an EMI pathway or some other pathway, I think is a much broader question for us to be thinking about.
Yeah, I just want to add my colleagues talking about the opportunities for EMI at international level. So EMI is an excellent opportunity for international level for students in order to undergo their mobility, to, I don't know, to be better qualified. But in terms of labor market, I think that globally the market needs more like professional advanced skills in the specific area, not just in English. So I'm just adding to your comments.
Yeah, just to respond.
I'd rather not argue, but debate the issue that English is not must. It's good as a tool to acquire that knowledge that in English language textbooks, a translation of which could be rather money-consuming, time-consuming, and sometimes it brings us to the idea that all budget of one country can go to translate all documents that are needed for even for one program. So, if we have not that tools like in English and read the content of this book, so we will just we couldn't gain our independence, our visibility in the world of emerging marketing. Thank you.
I would just like to add that the idea here, again, we're talking about English, and I think when we talk about English, we forget what goes with it. And that the reality is, what we actually need is not English, but a multilingual repertoire that all of our students, my students in the UK, as well as your students, wherever you come from, should be leaving education with the ability to communicate in more than one language. For most of you in the room, English will be one of those languages, but we should always remember English is part of the picture, it's not the whole picture, and that our solutions actually have to develop the whole language repertoire of learners, their first languages, the official languages of the countries they live in, international languages that are relevant to them, of which English may only be one. So, for example, here in Central Asia, English obviously does have its importance for the reasons we've heard, but so do other languages. And if we focus just on a single language, we miss the idea that we're trying to develop the whole repertoire of the student and the ability of the student to communicate about their knowledge in multiple languages. So EMI can develop their ability to communicate in English, but does it also transfer to an ability to communicate in other languages that they may need at various points in their life? We're not preparing these people necessarily to leave their home countries and go and work in the English-speaking world. How are we designing our EMI to open opportunities for them to use English in their local contexts and to be a mediator between the things that come from the English-speaking world and the local worlds in which they have to use that knowledge? I think this issue of mediation is something that gets left out if we start to think of education in terms of language silos. So we've got the English bit over here and the Uzbek bit over here, and we don't think about how they join together. We're separating these things too much, and we should be thinking much more about how we bring the abilities of students together and enable them to operate in all of their languages with the knowledge that they're getting. We do need to use English for very practical things. I agree you can't translate everything written in English into every language that it would need to be written in, so accessing it through English is good, but then what do you do with it? How do you apply English language knowledge in the local context? How do you communicate that knowledge to people who don't speak English, who live in your local context?
Yeah, and I want to add something that before starting the conference, I looked through our national qualification framework as well. I looked through the European qualification framework, but I couldn't find any point which stated the needs of EMI, like outcome of EMI, just only the communication, ability of advanced communication skills, nothing else. So all the, which is, I know that all the qualification frameworks are being developed, taking into consideration the labor market's requirements. So it's very important not to shift English knowledge with the EMI, with the professional abilities and professional skills. That's
question of developing other languages other than language. So just some background about Kazakhstan. I think everyone knows about the much talked trilingual education policy in Kazakhstan, which promotes using Kazakh, Russian and English as languages of instruction. So we have a network of elite schools, Nazarbayev intellectual schools, which are already implementing this trilingual education instruction. But the question is, yes, the three languages can be simultaneously developed, but the most prestigious universities in Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev University, KIMEP, some other universities provide instruction in English, right? If students want to join some other best international university, the language of instruction is English. So my research, I've been collecting data in mainstream schools and in these elite schools, and the research shows that the still motivation for the three languages is not the same among school students, and I think it's quite reasonable. So most of the teachers complain that students' motivation to learn Kazakh as L2 is very low. So my question is probably to everyone. So how to maintain this interest and motivation to learning all the three languages? How to support students' mother tongue or L1, L2, along with English, which is already a global English and the language of science.
Thank you very much, members of the panel, for your very insightful contributions. Just to summarize some of the main points we talked about in terms of opportunities, social mobility, employability, increased skills, making students ready and open to the world, innovation, enrichment through programs of immersion, social mobility, internationalization, and we have some caveats, right? The labor market is not linguistic dependent, which is something that probably we can discuss. The other caveat is there aren't many resources, and that probably contexts are quite different, and we have this idea of students being able to function in a variety of a multilingual repertoire, the ability for them to communicate in more than one language, and apply English to a local context. So I'm going to open up the discussion to the floor, and if you want to contribute any thoughts, any ideas, any questions, please do so. We want this to be an opportunity for a dialogue more than anything else. If you just want to raise your hand, someone will see you, and we have the first volunteer on table number 6. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the interesting session and a proper opportunity for Q&A. Vali Hussein from Azerbaijan, representing the State Examination Center. I have 2 questions. Now I can feel that mic is working. in the morning we talked about domain loss and how EMI contributes to employability. So my question is, can domain loss be compensated with employability? It's more of a philosophical question. The second question, continuing on Tony's remark about how we need to look at the English language, not as the target, but as a big picture, and then using English as a communication in different contexts. So if we name this phenomenon as intercultural competence, which was mentioned earlier, with a good English and intercultural competence, can EMI be skipped? If not clear, I can...
Thank you very much. Can you tell us the first question, and then we move on to the second one. The first question was about domain laws and if it can be compensated.
With the employability.
Right.
There's two extremes of the path.
Any ideas?
Okay. My answer to that is, I think, no. That I don't think employability should be equated with the ability to speak English. I think employability should be equated with the ability to speak English and the other language you're going to need in your employment. If you lose access to a domain, you lose the ability to communicate about that domain in one particular language. So, for example, if you were to lose the domain of engineering in Uzbek, you could only build bridges through English. You could only build tall buildings through English. I think, in reality, the engineer would need to be able to communicate the domain from English into Uzbek. I would like to know that whoever built my bridge actually communicated successfully in the building of my bridge, because I'm going to have to drive over it. And that domains, I think, need to exist in the usual languages of communication. The moment you lose a domain, you lose the ability to use that language for communication in that area. You lose its technical terminology and so on. There is still communication you can have without technical terminology, but being able to communicate the technical terms is really important. So I would say if you only had communicative ability in one language, you've missed something that's important for employability, and that you actually need the two things together. They're not alternatives, as far as I think.
Yeah. And the second question actually leads to that. If we cannot provide EMI to many universities, considering that exceptional resources that need to be put in, how would EMI be replaced or alternatively built with maybe other skills put in, like intercultural competency and very good English, to provide the justice part of the educational opportunity?
Oh, I'll start one too, because I have a very strong feeling about this one. And the first is that EMI and intercultural capability don't go together. It depends on the program. But if you teach mathematics through the medium of English, you have not taught somebody to communicate in another language. You have not taught them how to do the intercultural dimension that we claim. Intercultural learning is quite separate from mathematics learning. And any EMI program that claims to prepare people to communicate across cultures actually has to include teaching people to communicate across cultures. One of the things we have actually observed for a very long time is that study abroad opportunities can actually be an opportunity to decrease understanding of other people. That is, students go to study abroad and they come back with a much more negative attitude towards the people they went to live with than they had when they arrived. That's because they're unprepared to live in that community with those people. And if we're not actually serious about teaching intercultural capability, if we're not actually serious about teaching people how to respond to difference and to understand their responses to difference, then I think we're failing to achieve something that we say is central to what we're doing as language educators. And if we think that teaching a particular area of subject matter is going to lead to intercultural capabilities, I think we're deceiving ourselves. Just as when I was an undergraduate student learning French at a university in Australia, they taught me lots of grammar and vocabulary. If we're just teaching the grammar and vocabulary of maths, they're going to have the same problems I had when I went to France and discovering I couldn't communicate with French people. I had the grammar and I had the vocabulary, but I had no idea what French people were like or what I needed to do to be a part of their society. So I think a lot of things get conflated around EMI. The idea that it leads to a professional skill in and of itself, the idea that it leads to intercultural capability. None of these things are excluded from EMI, but they're not immediately present in EMI. And I think we're overselling EMI if we say that we can do all of those things. I think you can do the other things without EMI. Okay? It is not the universal answer to all questions. The thing is EMI the thing that your students most need at the moment for professional purposes, for mobility, and so on? But also, what else do they need, and where do they get all of the other things?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you very much for the question. Do we have any more questions from the members of the public? Table number 7, please. Thank you.
Hi there. Question for the panel then. So if EMI is not the answer or the pathway, how do we square the circle with the statistic from this morning that 94% of the academic articles that these students are supposed to be engaging with are in English?
It's continuation.
I'm not saying that they don't have to engage with English. I'm just questioning whether EMI is necessarily the right way for them to engage with it. I have absolutely no problems with EMI as a way of engaging with it. If what you want to do is to develop academic abilities in a particular language, then teaching content in that language is a very good way to do it. That will teach them to read the 94% of the articles. It won't teach them what to do over coffee at the conference. So I don't think EMI is the answer, but it could be part of the answer. But I never believe it's the entire thing.
But students aren't coming to our tertiary institutions to learn how to talk over coffee at a conference. Mm. They need to be able to engage with their content at a deep level, and if we don't support them doing that, we're not serving them.
I agree, they need to be able to engage with the content at a deep level, and I agree that EMI is a way to do that. I don't think it is the only way to do that. I think it can be a very effective way to do that if it's done well. And that's the really big issue. It has to be done well, or it's not going to achieve what you want it to achieve anyway. So I would actually argue that any educational program that sought to develop both content and language needs to have place in it to do both of those things. I think some EMI programs do. I think some EMI programs don't. The danger comes when people make the claim that EMI does all sorts of things, but it's not actually in the program. Okay. So I think EMI can be a very good way to get people to engage deeply with academic literature. If that's the aim of a program and that's all that you want to do, then it may be the solution. But if there is more that your students will actually need in the world beyond the university, then I don't think it's the whole solution. And the question is to find a way of teaching English that is going to provide students with what they need, not have a methodology that provides something and then say that's what students need. Okay. So for me, the decision should always be based on the needs of the students And then we should be looking for pathways to meet that and building in whatever is needed to meet those learning goals at the end. So as I said, EMI can be part of that. I'd be very skeptical, though, that EMI could do everything that students need to be able to do.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have another question on table 12, if a microphone can go to table 12. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to ask the panel to discuss the issue of EMI from the perspective of native speakerism. And the specific question is, do you think the global expansion of EMI put the native speaking professors at a more advantageous position than the non-native speaking professors in the academic job market? And if yes, is that fair?
I don't think that native speakers would have an advantage here, because non-native speaker of the language and the content have higher advantage here, because let's say native speaker of the language can speak, let's say, one language which is not the mother tongue of the students, right? Whereas non-native speaker speaks the language of the student and as well as another language, let's say in this case English, right? And this teacher has more advantage, because in the case where a student doesn't understand, let's say, a certain concept or anything, so your mother tongue can come to help you.
If I may be a little provocative, I'm fairly sure that most EMI around the world delivers poor student learning outcomes.
What?
But we saw this morning that the train has left the station long since and is travelling at high speed. How do we retrofit some sort of policy, strategy, methodology to the train to help it deliver better student outcomes?
I think students should be given a lot of support, because otherwise students, it's not easy for students to study everything in English in this case, right? So therefore students should be given a lot of support, language support, right? For example, where I work, in Westminster International University, students, we have a special section, it's called Student Support Services. Students are given language support as well as mathematical supports, because we have economics, and economics, you know, they may deal a lot of numbers, and the quant skills are important, and students have the right, and this is free service, they appoint a time and come and talk to the people who are available for them. Otherwise, yes, I understand your point of view. The train goes, but they wouldn't understand the content. And as well as also students can be given let's say lecture or seminar materials a little ahead, so that they can also have a look at it ahead, so that they can read a little bit if they understand, because as a, for example, student who studied in UK, I used to do that. I was talking to earlier colleagues, like, because I was a mature student, like, I knew that a certain content will be covered in the next class, and I see that it's difficult for me. What I do is I go to the library and study a little bit ahead, so that I can understand when I come to the lecture or seminar. So that was a bit easier for me, and this helped me, like, not to miss the train. Thank you.
Yeah, may I add something? So, talking about the national level, I want to mention that it's a very important topic that you raised up. So, there is no guidelines in many countries which can lead universities to conduct EMI teaching and learning processes. So, for example, in my country, in Armenia, now we are in the stage of developing developing long-term strategy, and we had already drafted it. And one of the main points is the internationalization. And after the adoption of the strategy, I'm sure that we need to implement some guidelines which lead professionals, academic staff to conduct their teaching and learning for EMIs. So it's a very important point. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the really fundamental issue about this is developing an EMI pedagogy. I think from a language policy perspective, EMI has often been a declaration that you will use English in the classroom. And there's more or less been an assumption that if you're providing the input, students will understand it and they will develop their English and all of those sorts of things. But I don't think that's the reality. And the way you teach students in their second language and also in your second language is very different from the way you teach a first language class in your first language. And I don't think we've yet developed the pedagogy of the content that allows someone who is working in their second language to teach people who are also working in their second language, particularly people who have limited abilities in that second language, who need to develop their language at the same time as they're developing content. I would hate to make the argument, although I think it's a true argument, I would hate to make the argument that teachers of content should also be language teachers, because I don't think anyone would listen. But I think in reality, they have to be. But the pedagogy is not necessarily only the thing that the teacher does. There is the pedagogy of the materials, the pedagogy of the support materials that go with those materials, and so on. And I think there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done at that level, the pedagogical and curriculum level, that hasn't been done yet. And to start to develop ways of translating this desire to teach through the medium of another language into good practice in doing it. I think there are instances of good practice all around the world. I think they're the minority, not the majority. And I don't necessarily know that good practice in one context transfers to another context either. But we do need to be spending much more time researching what goes on in classrooms, understanding the nature of learning that is happening or not happening, and understanding what's contributing to that, both in the successes and in the failures, and then developing local responsive ways of working to develop a pedagogy that's going to work for those teachers and those students in that context. And it doesn't mean getting in native speakers either, because they can be pretty appalling teaching people who don't speak their language as a first language. It's the pedagogy, not your relationship with the language, that I think is at the heart of this whole thing.
Thank you very much. Do we have more questions? Table number 4. Yes, please.
Thank you. Being critical, I guess EMI gained momentum because EAS failed to deliver the quality of education in terms of English as the language, foreign language. So if to compare, for example, international baccalaureate, so where the EMI is a predominant, and mother tongue-based curriculum, national curriculum, the difference, the key distinction is that the mother tongue-based curriculum is heavy. That means the mathematics-wise, and also the key subjects are heavy to absorb and digest. But EMI is more, at least from IB perspective, is more fun at primary level, and looking at different interdisciplinary methods and mainly kind of delivering the message in English. But when you push your kids to go to IB schools, IB program, at the primary level, they have no clue whatsoever at the very beginning. And I know that many research have been done so far to argue that it's not necessarily favorable to let your kids go to IB program at very low primary level. But I have been experimenting this on my kids, and I think they will be hating me someday in the future. So I have pushed him to go to public school, first grade. So then I transferred him to a private school. And at the very public school, he absorbed the key and underlying elements in mathematics, and he was doing very well at probably at the third or fourth grade level. But when he went to a private school at the second grade, he enjoyed more the environment and also specifically STEM key elements. He was going to engineering class and so forth. Then I pushed him to go to third grade to IB program. So now, when I ask him what distinctions are there, he can clearly justify that, there are differences. Probably public school, having more content-based delivery. IB is more fun, having, dance, music, and looking at different multidisciplinary aspects. But when it comes to English, let's say, if a kid doesn't know how to put together a sentence such as the bee flies, but he has to learn the word hive, so I think it doesn't make sense because probably 99% of non-English speakers do not necessarily know what hive is, right? And when I communicate that to the very instructor that he doesn't need to know the word, because there are words you have to know, there are words that they are helpful to know, and there are words you don't need to take care about because you don't necessarily use it on a daily basis. So there are different assumptions on the ground, and when we put different perspectives, I think it's quite, justifiable that it's better to go to primary school at the mother tongue-based program or national curriculum rather than, let's say, IB program or EMI instructional program, and then later switch probably to, Kazakh model is so appealing to many countries, and I think what they did is that they truly argue that if you want to study math, chemistry, physics, it's better to study in English rather than in a native language.
Sorry, is that your question?
No, that's my comment.
All right. If you have a particular question, because we're running out of time, so sorry to interrupt.
Okay, I'll just send it. So because math is taught everywhere in the same way, more or less. So, but if you want to study, let's say, history, it's better to study in your own native language. So if you want to study, let's say, trade, global studies, it's better to study in English or in a global language. So that's what the perspective is. Thank you.
Short comment on the pedagogy of EMI. I do agree that all subject teachers cannot become language teachers. At the same time, I argue that language and content or subject are inseparable. Even though you claim that you are not teaching language, you are a subject expert, but still, in order to make meaning, right, you still need to teach your students to use language as a tool to correct usage. At the same time, I argue that the pedagogy of EMI cannot be totally separated from general good pedagogy. It's scaffolding, making comprehensible input, and judicious use of translanguaging, valuing all the languages in the repertoire of the class, I think can still contribute towards quality EMI teaching.
Thank you very much. We have another question on table 14. Can I ask participants, please, to introduce yourselves, just tell us who you are, what country you are representing, and that will be great. Table 14, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is James Thomas, and I'm living in Tashkent at the moment, working on a British Council project. My question is, if we don't have a methodology, if we don't have resources, if we don't have goals clearly stated for EMI, we don't have support resources, should we actually have people on the train yet?
Okay, I'm the opinionated one, so I get this one. I think, no, we shouldn't have people on the train, but it's too late. We've got them on the train. It's left the station and it's traveling at speed. So what we actually have to do is find ways of making it work. I think, however, there are programs around that are doing a lot of damage. In the language planning literature, which is what I'm most familiar with, we keep on coming across studies of poor implementation that show that students don't understand what the teacher is saying. The teacher's level in English is not sufficient to actually communicate what he or she wants to say. And as a result, there's no content learning happening and there's no language learning happening. At the same time, students are being demotivated because there's nothing more demotivating than sitting in a classroom when you've got no idea of what's going on. And teachers are being demotivated because they used to be really good teachers and now they've become really bad teachers. And people are starting to leave the profession in order to avoid teaching in English because they don't do it well and they know they don't do it well. So there is a huge amount of bad practice out there that is damaging all of the participants. But as I said, I don't think we can stop the train. It's out of control at the moment. And we have to be doing whatever we can to try and support these people to be able to do what they're doing well and to develop ways of teaching that are perhaps not so purist in their mentality, that translanguaging is a perfectly acceptable process in an English medium classroom, but there are other things that need to happen as well. It doesn't mean teaching just in the L1 because you can't do it. So how do you make the most of the resources you've got to deliver the best educational experience? And in some contexts, it's going to be very difficult to do.
Yep. And I want to just add a comment. The labor market is transforming currently very fast, and it's an issue of time management. Till we are like thinking as a policymaker, I'm talking, till we are just thinking how to create some methodology or guidelines for helping teachers to conduct, to lead their program. So the demand is changing. So it's an issue also of, market. So we cannot just think only about the education processes. We also have to think about the changes of market needs.
Thank you very much, Susanna. We have a question on table 9. Yes, please.
Made between EMI in ASL context and in AFL context. So to me, it seems that Laura, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned a high quality EMI, and this actually created a lot of discussion for me. What is high quality EMI? Does it depend on a context where there is a language environment outside of the institution where the language of medium is English? And then I thought maybe EMI, a high quality EMI can be delivered in an ASL context versus an EFL context. So should we make such distinction? Is it a more accepted model for ASL context, or it can still be achieved and high results can be demonstrated in AFL context, and if yes, then how?
So the arguments I make are mostly underpinned by the research context in Kazakhstan. Of course, in the case of Kazakhstan, EMI is being implemented in EFL context, because for Kazakhstan, Kazakh or Russian may be the first language, right? At the same time, for some people, Kazakh and Russian can be the second language, and the English is always a foreign or a third language. By quality, in order to explain what I mean by quality EMI, again, I go back to the definition of the term, right? By EMI, we mean delivering the instruction of academic subjects in English, and we expect that students come prepared, and all the faculty instructing in EMI program have the sufficient language of English. So it means that learning is not jeopardized, and the EMI is not done just for the sake of a tick box. just to make sure that the university is providing this instruction. So still, there is a very blurred border in today's discussion between content and language integrated learning and EMI. Because in content and language integrated learning, we admit that our students can come with deficiencies, right, in the language. That's why we support them by making and putting an equal focus on content and language. In EMI, we still expect them come equipped and just learn content, because EMI is content-driven.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think that we have time for one more question, if that's the case, and somebody feels the urge to ask something. This is your time, right? Or rest your peace. No more questions? Table 1, please.
Thank you very much. I just want to get your reflections on the labour market, i.e. the future employers and their expectations of graduates and their levels of English.
Actually, we are trying to work very closely with the labor market, and what we can see that the most prominent issue now in Georgia is tourism, including medical tourism, for instance, and the high need of English-speaking professionals in the medical professionals. Another issue is that neighboring countries are somehow requested us to do some medical schools in English, and it started from 1990s, not now. So some universities has the experience of 20 years, some only 5-6 years. The programs are run in 2 languages, in Georgian programs and English language programs. Instructions are delivered in English language programs, of course in English. But if we had the experience of having low competencies of teachers, in bilingual teachers, I mean, we were asking the students to use the co-tutelage principle as well, and support our students who are coming, and to support our teachers as well, to give the appropriate contact in the meaning of the newcomers from other countries. And for sure, there are also the probability to give them additional English language classes to teachers and to students as well. So in the experience, and for another type of programs, for instance, we are running programs called San Diego University double diploma programs in engineering, in tourism, by the way, and artificial intelligence and chemistry. We got a big chance using this program, because most of programs are delivered via per distance, remotely. So, here in Georgia, we have the Georgian-speaking specialists in that field, teachers in that field, and if the student faces some problems, they can overcome that. So we are expanding this type of communication with French universities at this moment, and other countries as well. So what's most important for us is to need and the graduates from San Diego University this year, they got jobs in Amazon, in Google, in very high positions. I mean, they are not now only the interns in these companies, but they are already contracted professionals there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nino. On that note, we're going to finish the first part of this debate, which was about opportunities. Now we are turning the page, and we are going to consider the challenges, constraints, and pitfalls, and how to overcome them. I am alerting colleagues managing the technical stuff that we have some slides for this particular part. Everything is all right. So I am going to hand over to the very, very distinguished panel members that we have today. So, EMI problems in implementation, language policy, and planning perspectives. Tony, I think it's your turn.
Actually, I think I've probably already said everything that I was going to present to you, but I'll just run briefly. Could we go to the next slide, please? One of the things I wanted to think about as a constraint with you was the situation in applied linguistics at the moment in second language acquisition. And there's a very dangerous idea, I think, that emerged in the 1980s that has very much underlay what is happening in the field of EMI. And it's Krashen's idea that learning happened because of comprehensible input, and that comprehensible input was necessary and sufficient for language learning. And I think one of the big constraints, and I've said this already, on EMI is firstly that the input is often not comprehensible. That is, either the student's language level is not sufficient to deal with the complex content, in which case they don't understand, or the teacher's ability to express it doesn't happen in a comprehensible way, and so students don't understand. And that it's not simply a language problem, it's a language and pedagogical problem simultaneously. And that as a result of that, firstly, often the necessary condition of comprehensible input just isn't happening. So you don't have language learning and you don't have content learning. So the comprehensibility issue is a key thing that needs to be developed. The other issue is a theoretical change that's happened in the field of second language acquisition since the 1980s that seems to often get left out of some of the thinking in policy documents around EMI, and that is that input is necessary but not sufficient, that you need things other than input. Krashen's idea basically meant that the language teacher just became a source of language. And as long as you were communicating with the students, language learning was happening. We now know that's not the case. And so the issue for EMI then, and again I've made this point, is what other learning needs to be happening? What does the teacher need to do in addition to providing comprehensible input? And one of those things that is really important is literacy, because literacy is not acquired through input. And EMI and the sorts of things we're trying to develop are very literacy-based. Okay, there is an oral dimension, but if we're talking about reading textbooks and so on, there is a literate dimension. And so the question of literacy and the underlying academic literacy that learners are bringing to their learning and the development of that literacy is a really big issue that I think has not been addressed in a lot of EMI pedagogy. I think just looking over things, I've said all of the other things on my slide, so I won't go ahead with those and repeat them. I'll just stop there to sort of say, we in applied linguistics need also to be thinking about our input into this, that perhaps we're not using the most developed theory in thinking about how we go about EMI, and we need to be thinking about much more socially oriented theories of learning and so on that tend to get excluded in the EMI classroom and the sorts of pedagogies that are around at the moment. And look at things like, as Laura was saying, scaffolding as good elements of pedagogy and so on, and developing those much more in the content area. Because one of the big constraints on EMI is the fact that in many programs, learning is not happening, either of content or of language. There are others in which learning of both is happening. I would be very surprised if there were ones where you're getting learning of content but not learning of language. Perhaps there are others where you're getting learning of language but not of content. But we need this balanced pedagogy that enables each to support the other. And we need to be thinking how we're going to push our own theories to develop this field. So Thank you, and you could take my slides away now.
To talk about the practical sides, resources to establish a very good EMI institution, you should have a very good finance budget because all the literature in English is very expensive. And also, already Tony talked about teachers as well. You need to find the teachers who speaks both English and who knows the content very well. And this is not always possible. Let's say in the case of Uzbekistan, right? Yeah, you would find content teachers, and then the issue is they don't speak the language, or they don't speak. They speak the language. They don't know the content very well. So there is no balance, right? So therefore, you should be thinking this very well before establishing. Otherwise, these practical issues also will be tiresome.
One of the issues that comes out again and again in the language policy literature is that EMI tends to work backwards from the way you develop good policy. That is, you institute EMI and then you work out how you're going to deliver it, rather than developing an implementation plan that you have in place when you decide to do EMI. Quite often, governments introduce a policy saying we'll have EMI and then say to universities, work out how you're going to do it. And as a result, the practice lags very well behind the policy, and we need to start catching up. We need to be investing in the implementation and the implementation needs and doing those properly, working out what resources we actually have to implement a program well. If you're going to use textbooks written for native speakers, what support materials go with those textbooks to enable your learners to use those textbooks? Because you can't just give them the textbook. If you're going to have a teacher working with those textbooks, what does that teacher need to do on top of that textbook to make the textbook relevant for local reality and connect with what students actually do know? What resources might be needed, perhaps in the first language of the student, to support those connections? There is a huge amount of materials development that's needed, and I don't mean writing your own textbooks necessarily, but working out how you support the use of what's out there. There's a huge amount of curriculum that's needed, looking at how you fit that textbook to your local context. And there's a huge amount of professional learning for English teachers, for content teachers, for collaborations between those two, that in reality should all be in place before you do EMI, but now we've decided to do EMI and we have to suddenly put these things into place. And I think until we really focus seriously on the implementation dimension, EMI programs are going to continue to produce poor learning. And those people who've got the implementation right are actually producing good learning, but they're not the majority yet. So how do we change the implementation? How do we really resource the implementation? And I think your point about money is really important. It is not a cheap option. It's actually a very expensive option.
Yeah, another thing is that discourse used in EMI and the first language, and they are quite different, and students following the EMI, they have to learn the English discourse. It's not always easy for them to do that. The other day, it's not about content, but it's about the way students are speaking in English. A girl asked to give a chair, and a boy gave the chair and said, "Sit." This is kind of interesting, because the English has a quite different discourse, right? And this is just a language issue, right? And there might be a lot of content issues as well.
I just want to add something. So before starting the project, I tried to make some exercise to collect all the data of EMI within the higher education institution of Armenia. So I was a little bit upset coming to the point that we don't have a much number of EMI study programs also. And I talked too much with our administratives with higher education institutions. So what is the challenges, what is the problems, what's the issue of the situation? And because I know that Armenian students are very ambitious in their demands, yes. And the point comes from the side of university is that there is definitely a shortage of qualified, linguistically qualified teachers in terms of EMI. That's the point. So we have a challenging situations within the teaching process, not the learning. More teaching than the more learning. So that's our situation.
One of the challenges I see is I think the lack of alignment between the levels of education. So if we want to implement EMI in higher education, we still need systemic changes in secondary school level as well. It is about teaching methodology of general English and some content areas in English. So there should be a succession between what is happening in secondary education and higher education as well. Thank you.
Okay. It's a very interesting debate, as you can hear and see. Unfortunately, we just need to stop here. I'm pretty sure that there will be more questions, and if there are more questions, these are the people probably you need to come and talk to. So thank you very much to the members of the panel. One last thing, at the beginning we said that we were going to do the voting again, but I'm more interested in the people who put their hands up, who were sitting on the fence and decided. Could you again put your hands up, please? It's not to embarrass you, I promise. Thank you very much. Only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Can I ask you to put your hand down if you still remain, let's say, undecided? Okay, there are people who are still very undecided, but the minority. We're going to stop here. There is a lot to talk about, and one of the things that I probably need to emphasize as a sort of a final remark is this idea of making the international local. And I think this was a thread that was repeated all throughout the different presentations by the members of the panel. We're going to have a break, I suppose. I don't have any further instructions. So thank you very much. And well, I hope that it was a really rich session for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you too, Mario.